Welcome to this Travel Weekly webcast on the future of aviation. I'm Ian Taylor from Travel Weekly, and I'm joined by John Holland-Kaye, Chief Executive of Heathrow Airport. Welcome, John.
Hi, hello, Ian.
Good to see you. I wonder, what do you make of the Chancellor's announcement on the job support scheme? It must be helpful in alleviating some of the pressure on Heathrow.
Well, it's very welcome, and really for two reasons. The first is that I think we can see we're going to be living with COVID for a long time, and people have been talking about there being one wave and trying to avoid a second wave. Well, we don't know how many waves we're going to have, and how long we will need to survive for with a very much reduced level of passengers coming through. But we can see that aviation will be one of the last sectors to recover. So every little helps as far as that's concerned. So we really welcome the Chancellor's announcement. And if it can help to protect a few more jobs, then that's doubly welcome, because that is one of the things that's most important to us in this crisis. We protect as many jobs as we can.
Okay, we've yet to see the detail of the scheme, although the Chancellor made clear it would be available to large companies whose revenue is affected by COVID. Do you see this having an impact on the consultation you're currently involved with the unions over possible pay cuts, job losses and so on?
Well, I don't think it will, because we, of course, started that process long before we started getting into this second wave. So this will relieve some of the pressure that is being added to us. And of course, even the job retention scheme that we had in place over the last 6 months has only made a small contribution to the overall cost challenge that we have. So while it's welcome, it is not a game changer by any means. But we're very grateful that the Chancellor has at least given a bit more breathing space than would otherwise have been the case over the next few months.
Okay, so what more do you need to see from the government now? I'm thinking, obviously you want to see testing brought in to alleviate the travel restrictions. Where are you up to with that?
Well, you're absolutely right. We are doing everything we can to reduce the amount of cash we're burning through every month. It costs a lot of money to keep an airport running, and it even costs a lot of money to keep it safe, even if it were to close. So we are burning through our cash reserves very quickly. And while cost cutting helps and the Chancellor's job retention scheme help, nothing helps as much as getting more passengers coming through, because that's the only source of revenue that we have. And that's why we're keen to see testing coming in, to make sure that people can continue to travel once more, but only if they can make us confident that they don't have COVID. And of course, the vast, vast majority of people don't have COVID. Over 99% of people have never had COVID. And if we can make sure we filter them out and get them flying, then that would be a great thing. And so what we're expecting is that we will have a testing system coming in for high-risk countries. That would involve some level of quarantine, but that quarantine might take place in someone's home country before they travel. And there'll be a test to make sure that they don't have COVID. Now, the details of how that works and how long any quarantine period might last is still to be worked out. And of course, we haven't yet got the UK government to say yes to this. But we are doing everything we can to give them the confidence that we can reopen our borders safely with countries like the United States without importing COVID.
Okay, you've had the facilities set up at Terminals 2 and 5 for some time, haven't you, with Collinson and Swissport and so on. It must be frustrating having the facilities there and not doing any testing.
Well, it is. We've actually put lots of things in place in the expectation that they might be needed as part of the solution, including trialling rapid point of care tests and putting in place thermal scanning. And this is really to make sure that we can test what will work ahead of time and be ready to go very quickly. And so we're trying to work with the government on a set of solutions. The Collinson Swissport facility is a really good one, and we don't know whether testing at the airport will end up being part of the solution. We know that the government isn't comfortable with just a single test on arrival to give them confidence that people aren't carrying COVID when they come into the country. And that's because if you've only just contracted the disease, you may not show up on a PCR test. And that's why they prefer to have a period of quarantine before people take the test, just to be confident that they have been able to pick up any COVID cells. So, but it may well be the case that those testing facilities at the airport are needed, in which case we're ready to go quickly once the government says yes.
Okay, have you put specific proposals to the government? There's been talk about a corridor to New York with testing at both ends. There's been talk of 2 tests on arrival and so on. What specifically have you proposed?
We've proposed 2 things. The first is that we have an alternative to quarantine for people coming from high-risk countries. And that would be to have a shorter period of quarantine on arrival, followed by a test. And whether that test is after 5 days or 7 days, that would be enough to give the government confidence that people aren't coming in with COVID. Now, we don't know yet whether there would be a need for a first test and a second test. That's something that we would need to work out with the government. So our proposal is that that should apply to any country around the world. And other than those where we don't need any quarantine because the disease levels are low. Now, the second proposal we've made is for a pilot of what we hope could become a common international standard for air travel, which is to have the testing taking place before people get on a plane. And the good thing about that is that it means that if there is any need for a quarantine period, you can spend that time in your own home rather than in a hotel in a strange country. You can take away any anxiety that you might be required to quarantine for a full 14 days when you arrive. And of course, it means that anyone on the plane from that country has been tested as well for COVID, and you're unlikely to catch the disease during your journey. So it has to be the better way of doing things. And we're proposing to pilot that approach on the New York-London route. And we've chosen that because it is the busiest route in the world, that transatlantic route, hugely important to the UK's economy as well as to the US economy. And if we can't make it work on that route, then we're not going to be able to make it work. But what we hope is that by working with the UK government and the US government to get this up and running, we can find out what works for both of them, iron out any glitches there might be, and then we could make this a common international standard that we could start to apply to other countries as well. And the reason that this is more complicated to set up than just the testing post-arrival is that, of course, you've got to have mutual recognition between 2 different countries of one another's testing regimes. And that's always going to be a little bit more complicated to set up than something that you can control yourself. So that's why we're proposing 2 approaches in parallel with each other.
Okay, that seems sensible. What, in your view, is causing the government to delay making a decision on the first of those proposals? I mean, Grant Shapps announced in Parliament on the 7th of September that he was considering a 2-test proposal. So what's the hold-up?
Well, I think what's really held things up in the last few weeks is the government has had its own crisis in dealing with testing capacity in general, and has been concerned that we don't have international passengers coming into the UK, adding to the challenges that the government's testing facilities have. And that they might get to a point where they're having to choose as whether they give tests to people in care homes and the NHS or give tests to international passengers. And we can all understand that. So that's why we're proposing that to avoid this becoming another burden for the government, all of these tests should be done privately through companies such as Collins and Swissport, and should be paid for by the individual. So it's not putting a burden on the government purse. And I think for the early days when we're getting these up and running, I think that's a very fair thing to do. It won't mean that we will immediately bounce back to a significant level of traveling, but it will allow those people who really want to travel for business or visiting friends and relatives to start to get back closer to normal.
Okay, so it would be a partial solution, I guess. The passenger would pay. How much would the tests cost if there were 2 tests, for example?
Well, the PCR tests cost around £150, so they're really expensive. And the reason they're expensive is that you have to have a lab technician taking the swab. It has to be sent off to a lab and examined and then sent back to you. And so it's a very laborious process. And this is why we have been looking at other forms of testing, such as a rapid point of care test, which is a much quicker test that could give you results in anywhere between 20 seconds and an hour and a half. And we looked at the different types of testing that exist, and we trialed 3 of them, really to see whether they could be operationalized in a normal airport environment. And we fed those results back to the government's Condor scheme, which is responsible for testing. Now, we can't assess the medical validity of any of those tests. That's something that the government is doing through its own laboratories. But we have heard from the Prime Minister that in the second half of October, he is hoping to go to trials of 3 different types of tests, and we'd love to be involved in that. And of course, if that is adopted by the government, that would significantly speed things up. And if I can just give you an example of that, United Airlines has just announced that they are starting a trial of that kind of testing with Hawaii, where passengers would take a PCR test, which is the gold standard of testing, about a week before they travel, and then they take a rapid point of care test from Abbott Laboratories at the airport before they travel, just to confirm that they don't have COVID. And that kind of system, you can see starting to allow people to get back to normal.
Okay. The Airlines UK and the chief executives of the UK Airlines wrote to the Prime Minister earlier this month, urging him to introduce testing by the end of September. That seems wholly unrealistic now, but are you fairly confident that a trial in the second half of October is going to happen?
Well, I think it is possible that we could even get something up and running, or rather a decision to be made by the end of September. Now, it'll take a couple of weeks between a decision and actually being able to put it into practice. So definitely in October, we could have this up and running if the government says yes. And I think what we've learned is that the government is burdened with a huge number of difficult decisions to deal with. And they need the private sector to come in and help them to solve some of these problems for them. And that's why we haven't been critical of the government. We've been trying to propose real world solutions to some of the difficulties that they have, and just try to move things on to help to support the recovery of the economy and protect the aviation sector.
Sure. And just to be clear, that these PCR tests initially, would that be £150 for each of the 2 tests, if that's what the government decides is required?
That's currently the cost for each of the tests. So actually it may be better that rather than having 2 tests, we just have 1 test after 5 or 7 days. And that would make it cheaper. And might also overcome one of the other concerns I know the government has, which is that if you've taken 1 PCR test and been clear, and you then go into quarantine, you may not be as diligent about sticking to quarantine if you think that you're clear because of the first test. And we can all understand that. So it might be a cheaper and better solution would be to just have a single test at the end of the 5 or 7 day period.
Okay. IATA has called this week for systematic testing of all air passengers pre-departure, 100% tests. Is that a realistic aim at this stage in the crisis, would you say?
I think it really depends on the testing capacity. If there is the rapid point of care tests that can be produced at scale, then that might be possible. But I think we can see that lots of people in the sector are just looking for ways of getting aviation back to some semblance of normality. And here in the UK, we've gone from having only about 3% of normal traffic in the worst months of COVID to now 15 to 20% of normal traffic, nowhere near enough to support the aviation sector. But we are better off in some ways than many other countries which just have blanket quarantine. And that's because the government has taken a risk-based approach to opening their borders. So we're in a better state than we could have been. And many other airlines and airports in other countries are really struggling with minimal passengers at the moment. And you can see why they are just encouraging their governments to move to some form of testing to get things moving. But I think what is clear is that there is consensus that testing is the answer to get people back to flying again in the absence of a vaccine, and that we need to have a common international standard for doing that, and that testing before departure is the better way of doing it. And that's really what we are moving towards. And the quicker we can get this New York-London pilot up and running, the better. So we can see what works and then see how we can roll it out to other international countries.
Okay. The IATA proposal is for an antigen test, not a PCR test. So not a test for the presence of the virus, but for antibodies to it. Does that seem realistic? A realistic solution at this stage?
Well, an antibody test, as I understand it, is not accepted by governments as being evidence that somebody can't catch the disease again. Yeah. So I think the governments would want to focus on testing for whether someone is actively has the disease and is contagious. And the PCR is the gold standard, which is accepted in countries around the world. I think the kind of rapid point of care tests, such as the Abbas laboratory test, which is being used in the States, is the next step forward. I think it can give results in 30 minutes or so. But of course, while that might be accepted in the US, it may not be accepted by other countries. And that's the challenge that we have with moving to alternatives to the PCR test. There's got to be some international acceptability of it. And of course, you've got to be able to scale up the production enough to be able to use it on a much wider scale. And that's why I don't think we're going to have a quick solution to testing, which will get all of us back to traveling normally quickly. But we can start to do things, we can start to open up testing. First, establish that testing is a good alternative to 14 days of quarantine. Then find quicker alternatives to the PCR test that give you the results faster, but also cost less, but without giving up on the level of accuracy.
Okay, and would it be realistic to think there might be the kind of regime you're talking about in place in time for the summer 21 schedules, for example?
Oh, absolutely, yes. And I think we can start to get testing up at some level of scale in the next few months. You know, I'd love to have the New York-London pilot up and running by Thanksgiving, end of November. That seems entirely feasible, and really the sooner the better. And if we can get some good results out of that over the following few months, there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to extend that out to other countries. And once we have a clear solution, we can then focus on the next challenges, such as how can we scale up the capacity for testing? How can we find a quicker alternative to the PCR test? And I know that just as with the UK government trialing these rapid point of care tests, other countries will be doing the same. And so it is quite possible that in Q1, Q2 of next year, we see rapid point of care tests becoming more of a normal thing to use and starting to come into the aviation sector. But the demand for these will be enormous from all kinds of sectors. And it might take much longer before there is sufficient supply to be able to satisfy the needs of all travellers.
Yeah, why should air travellers be a priority for the government when, you know, the testing regime at the moment isn't capable of delivering sufficient tests for health workers and teachers and so on? Well,
clearly, air travellers shouldn't be competing with the NHS and care homes. I don't think anyone would argue that. And really, this is why we need to have a privately delivered solution, so we're not competing with them. But air travellers are hugely important to the UK economy. We're the 5th biggest economy in the world, and yet we're a tiny little island nation. And the only thing that allows us to have this huge economy and support 33 million jobs is our international trade. And most of that goes by air, of course. And from Heathrow, 40% of all of our exports go out of Heathrow in the belly hold of passenger planes. And if passengers aren't flying, then our British exports are not getting to market. And that's just the physical goods, let alone the service sector, which is even more dependent upon planes. And so this really is vital to the future of the country. And we need to be in a position where governments aren't having to choose between teachers and travellers or people who work in theatres. We need enough capacity that people who need to be tested can be tested. But I think we also need to make sure that the importance of aviation is really well understood by government and by key decision makers in number 10, that we're not just another economic sector. We are the enabler of all other economic sectors. Without us, there won't be the tourists coming here. There won't be the international students coming to support our universities. There won't be the exports. There won't be the foreign direct investment. These are so vital to the UK economy, and they are all enabled by aviation.
Okay, the government is accused repeatedly, often by people in the travel industry, of not listening to the sector. But you've said you're sympathetic to the government's challenges, and Grant Shapps, when he spoke in Parliament most recently on September the 7th, name-checked you personally twice, saying he'd spoken to you that week. So the government clearly is listening to the aviation and travel industries, but it doesn't appear convinced. Or is it that just that it is not the priority we would all like it to be?
I think it's more the latter. They have so many things on their plates. Just keeping the nation healthy and avoiding the catastrophic impacts of the disease itself. And of course, there's a point at which they have to get the more balance between saving people's livelihoods as well as saving people's lives. And I found it interesting over the last 4 or 5 months that when I started talking about a common international standard, probably back in May, there was the response from the people interviewing me was very much, what are you talking about? How can you possibly talk about getting people flying again in the middle of this disease? But in the last few months, the mood has definitely changed. There's much more understanding that without aviation and without steps to protect the economy, then millions of jobs in this country will be lost. And in conversations I've had with government where there hasn't been an understanding of how important this is, I've actually got quite angry about it, because when I look at Heathrow, we employ 75,000 people. I know a lot of my colleagues in frontline roles would be devastated by some of the things that are going to be happening to aviation if we don't get it up and running again. And so I felt really passionate that we need to fight to protect people's jobs here, both in both the Heathrow and in the aviation sector, but also in all the companies that depend upon aviation. Because you know that if somebody loses their job, it has a devastating impact upon them, particularly in a recession where it's going to be even harder to get a new job, and particularly around an airport where so many of the households depend upon the airport itself. And the kind of devastation that can be caused by that is the equivalent of what happened when mines closed in the north or when the Port of London closed in the East End. We cannot allow that to happen if there's anything that we can do to prevent those jobs being lost.
Okay, you sound in pretty good heart, John, but is there a cut-off point the Heathrow and the industry will reach if the government continues to delay on making a decision on a trial and testing and so on?
Well, Alex Cruz, the chief executive of British Airways, has said that without testing, then British Airways won't survive. And I think that really captures the challenge we have. If we have to wait for a vaccine before we can get people flying again, then I suspect that not only will Heathrow be Britain's only hub airport, it will be Britain's only airport by that point. And we may not have any UK airlines to serve. That would be a catastrophic outcome for the UK. And I often think to what happened in Italy when Alitalia went bust in the global financial crisis. It wiped out their connectivity from Italy. And now for many routes, you have to fly through Germany to get to global markets from Italy. Now that's what could happen to the UK if we lost our hub carrier, British Airways. As we have left the EU, we'd be depending upon Frankfurt and Charles de Gaulle to get to our global markets. Now that is not acceptable for an independent trading nation. We have got to stand up for ourselves and protect the trading routes that make us one of the world's great trading economies. So this is absolutely in the national interest that we keep aviation going, but we can't take it for granted. Without support from government, and I don't mean financial support, I just mean allowing people who don't have COVID to fly, then the aviation sector could be destroyed in this country. And that would be a tragedy. And if that sounds like catastrophizing, look at what happened to the Port of London. London docks in the 1950s were the biggest and busiest in the world. By 1969, they were closed. These terrible things can happen. The best in the world can be closed down. And you cannot rule that out happening in aviation as well.
Okay, let's be optimistic then. Let's assume the Prime Minister does sign off on testing by the second half of October, as you've said he's indicated. What are the prospects for recovery in that scenario?
Well, we really don't know how this is going to play out. And for all of our businesses, we have to assume that we're going to be in the COVID crisis for the long haul. There is no silver bullet. Even if the government says yes to PCR testing this week, it will take some time before that really starts to get passenger numbers up to anything significant. It will take even longer for a common international standard and longer again for a rapid point of care test. And then at some point we may have a vaccine. And what we have to do is to plan our resources for all of those scenarios. We need to conserve our cash so that if we get very few more passengers than we have today for the next 12 to 18 months, we can still survive. But equally, we need to plan our resource so that if demand comes back quicker, then we can scale up and take advantage of it more quickly. And that's one of the challenges that, as the Chief Executive of Heathrow, I have to try and work through. And I know that all of our airline customers and partners are doing exactly the same. But the most important thing is that we survive this crisis and are able to grow again when we come to the other side. But we will come to the other side. And I want to make sure that Heathrow comes through this and is able to regain its position as the world's best airport, best hub airport, the best connected airport in the world, and really make sure that Britain can stride the world as a strong, independent trading nation.
Do you share IATA's view that probably it'll be 2024 now before we see a full recovery of international air traffic?
That's quite possible. I've seen scenarios which show that. I think we really don't have enough information at the moment to know what that longer term looks like. We have to plan for all scenarios.
Okay, and where does this leave your plans for a third runway, John?
Well, funny enough, they once we do get back to full capacity, whether that's in 2022 or 2024, the need for the third runway will absolutely still be there. When we think about what our future needs are as a country, we need to be as well connected to the economies of the 21st century in China and India as we are to the United States. And to do that, we are going to need a bigger hub airport at Heathrow, and that will require the third runway. Now, whether we get that open by 2030 or in the early 2030s, I don't know, but we will need that as a country. And I think one of the lessons we've learned from previous economic downturns is that you make a mistake by not investing in the infrastructure when you don't need it, because if you do that, it won't be there when you do need it. So the best time to plant a tree is today.
Okay, John, you've been very generous with your time. A final word on your key priority.
Well, at the moment, I'm doing everything internally I can to protect jobs. I know how important that is. And the best way to do that is to get people who don't have COVID flying again. And the way to do that is through testing.
Lovely. Thank you very much, John Holland-Kaye.
Thank you.